Hey, welcome to the Bioinformatics chat. Before we start, I have a few announcements to make. Housekeeping, as they say. Announcement number 1. For the first time, I'm running a survey of the Bioinformatics chat listeners. This is just to better understand what kind of people listen to this podcast and how I and my future guests can better serve you. Don't worry, I have no intentions of running ads here, so the only thing I'm trying to better target is the show itself. So if you're a regular or semi-regular listener, please take just 1 minute of your time and answer 6 short questions. You can even pause the podcast right now, unless of course you're driving or handling biohazardous materials, and go to bioinformatics.chat/survey, or you can also find the link in the show notes as usual, and I'd really appreciate your feedback. Announcement number 2, I'll be attending the Woodstock Bio Conference in Tel Aviv in mid-February. If you're also there, hit me up and let's meet. And finally, a bit of context about today's episode. It turned out to be very relevant to the current events, although we didn't really plan it this way. I first saw Kris's preprint in November, and that was when I invited him to the podcast. And we recorded this episode at the beginning of this year, when the Wuhan coronavirus outbreak was already going on, but at least I wasn't really aware of it, and I suspect Kris wasn't either. So we don't mention it, I think, although Kris often gives the example of the SARS virus, which is also a coronavirus and a closely related one to the Wuhan virus. And the tone of our discussion was perhaps more lighthearted than it would be if we recorded this episode today. Of course, our thoughts go out to everyone who has been affected by the virus. In any case, I think this is a great episode and it will help you understand how the modeling of epidemics is done in general, and also maybe it will help you make sense of the analytics regarding the current virus outbreak. So I hope you'll enjoy it. Today my guest is Kris Parag. Kris is a research fellow at Imperial College London, and we will be talking about epidemics. Kris, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, hi, thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, so obviously we should work hard to prevent epidemics or try to sort of fight them. But we will be talking about modeling epidemics, like using mathematics and statistics and maybe even information theory to describe epidemics. So why is that useful? Why should we spend any time on that instead of like developing the cure?
Yeah, so what? Well, first of all, even if, so say the most common measure, or the most common measures against infectious diseases, and I should probably say like we're only focusing on like communicable diseases, then you could kind of think about the vaccination, the quarantine, which is kind of like isolation, and if it's animals, it's culling, right? Now, if for vaccination particularly, we could spend time, and a lot of time is spent developing better vaccines. But if you need to figure out how to deploy them, how to do them in a resource-efficient manner, and I guess when to start and when to stop even, because you might see some infected cases of a disease, but it doesn't mean an epidemic has actually begun. All of these sort of questions around how to use these medical tools, we kind of need models which describe what we consider to be the physics of the epidemic.
Yeah, and also, like, there is this notion, I think, fairly well known nowadays, the herd immunity.
Yes.
And we can actually understand it, right, through the lens of these epidemics models.
Yeah, that's correct. Actually, herd immunity as a concept kind of comes out, or having the idea sort of comes out of the dynamics of some of the early epidemic models. It comes out as sort of what you consider a threshold. So there's some threshold of the population that needs to be vaccinated to prevent the spread of a disease. And the equations that sort of describe that spread Um, to start, just to get slightly technical, they use this parameter called the reproduction number. And what they found, the reproduction number describes, say, the average number of people an infected person will infect in the next upcoming days, and on average. And that number was found to actually link directly to the percentage of the population that should be vaccinated. And once you use that relationship, you get this sort of threshold, which informs the herd immunity. So if that threshold is like 80%, then you'd say as long as 80% of the population is vaccinated, we don't expect the epidemic to spread. And hence that effectively defines herd immunity.
Right. So let's talk about some of the models that have been developed over time to describe and even predict the dynamics of an epidemic. What were the classical, the original models, or maybe the most well-known models that were applied to epidemics?
Yeah. So probably the most popular is called the SIR model, which means susceptible, infected, recovered. And it's what it does. It's sort of developed. It's been used widely and used to. Variations of it are used. They're used up until, say, the last Ebola outbreaks, for example. They're very practical. And what these models say is that we think of an epidemic or how an infectious disease goes through a population in terms of what state it leaves individuals in. And to kind of like, to get what that means is, so the S being susceptible means that someone is classed as susceptible if they could be infected. They have not been infected yet. They're just sort of naively minding their own business in the population. An infected person obviously contracted the disease, and a recovered person is someone who's been vaccinated or, for the purposes of modeling, has even died. The point being that they can't continue to spread the disease. That's obviously disease specific, because for Ebola, even if you do die, you can keep transmitting. So this model actually dates back even as far as the 1930s. And when you sort of, what you do is called a compartmental model. So you say, well, we think about all the susceptible people as one class or one compartment, all the infected people as another class, and all the recovered people. And we sort of describe, and this is where the mathematics comes in. We sort of describe what physics determines S going to I going to R, and maybe even going back to S, because for some infections, even after you recover, you could potentially be reinfected. Now, and that's traditionally done with ordinary differential equations and so on. And it's actually using that type of model, they were able to derive these expressions for the vaccination coverage that leads to herd immunity, for example. And this model it's sort of it's been extended a lot to account for other various different classes that you might put in. So, for example, for Ebola, they put in a class that said you've been exposed, but you haven't registered any symptoms yet, and they call that E. So we just sort of put these classes together and we describe how they interact with each other, and that forms the basis of the most widely used set of models, which are called compartmental models.
Right, and on its face, it's a very simple model, and it's sort of reminiscent of models in population dynamics, where you have like different areas where some organisms may live, and they sort of migrate between these areas. These are the compartments, right? And also, like, this model by itself, it sort of describes, or at least what you just described, it doesn't give like an immediate mathematical expression. It's sort of like a conceptual description of a model, which you can use, I guess, different mathematical models, mathematical methods to investigate. Like, you can treat it as an agent-based model where you model each person individually and sort of track, do maybe simulations of how they become infected or how they recover.
Yep.
Or you can model these with ODEs, ordinary
Yep.
differential equations, right? Or maybe you can model the probabilities, like something like a master equation, right? Can you talk about these options and maybe what are the popular ways to turn this into a proper mathematical model?
Sure. So far, I've sort of, as you correctly pointed out, just conceptually said that the way we're looking at the sort of the world or the population of interest that could have a disease spreading is to sort of class people, right? The key underlying bit of dynamics, if you want to call it, that is what you would call a contact process. And all it means is that the way an infection spreads is that somehow a susceptible minding his own business or her own business randomly encounters an infected person and the infection passes between them. And the rate at which that infection with just this sort of contact occurs is sort of proportional to the number of susceptibles in the population and the number of infected in the population, right? Now, in reality, those numbers are fluctuating stochastically. So whereas the ODE would put in a term that's so if S is the number of susceptibles and I is the number of infected, might put in a term that's proportional to S times I, and run you just solve the ODEs with some integrator. What you do instead is you'd start to think about what's the probability that one infected person leads to multiple, like 2 infected people, and so on. And then that's where you'd still be using this S times I, but now it would come into the rate of change of these probabilistic equations. And particularly, and as you rightly said, like once we move into getting it into very, like, I guess you'd say, like more modern mathematical methods, what we do is we use an individual level model. So we say, as I said before, an infected person going to 2 infected people, and then we describe that with what they call a chemical master equation. And I won't go too much into how that's actually constructed, but to just give you an idea of what that means is, so the reason why it's called chemical master equation is because it's been used, it was sort of came out of stochastic chemistry, where you'd say like 2 molecules collided at some rate and a product was produced.
Yeah, and you can think about this process, right, also as a sort of chemical process where an infected person is sort of like an enzyme or a catalyst,
yes,
which
exactly.
turns a healthy person into an infected person.
Exactly. So exactly what you said. So in the case when 2 molecules collide, if those molecules are X and Y, the rate of that reaction is usually given as proportional to X times Y, the number of X and the number of Y. And that's precisely the same for this contact process that underlies the SIR type models. So that's the very heart of these probabilistic methods. And they're very useful, but one of the issues with them is that as you start getting more data, and your data in this case would be, you're looking at hospitalizations of infected people, numbers of reports coming in, this sort of stuff. So it sort of counts of individuals, and you might also keep counts of potential deaths, counts of vaccines initiated, and so on. But the point of this model is that as you start to want to predict more complicated behaviors, you start putting more classes in. So for example, if we were looking at flu, we might put a class in for people at an older age and people at a younger age, because maybe they have a higher potential for spreading or being infected. And when you start doing that, number of unknowns, you could say, in your equations start rising rapidly. And that might be okay if you're interested in, say, specifically what's the likelihood that an older person will get infected, and hence should we focus our vaccination resources on older people because they're more at risk, which is definitely the way to go. But often you might want some coarser sort of ideas. So, for example, will this epidemic end, or how large will this epidemic become? And in effect, what you really want is just a single time series of infected people, and you're sort of collapsing down quite a large model to produce almost a one-dimensional prediction. And when you want to go to that level, then you take a different look at how you model epidemics.
Right, and that's the sort of models that we will be mainly talking about, right?
Discussing, yeah.
So specifically the renewal model. So can you describe, and you sort of did, but make it explicit how, in what way a renewal model is different from the SIR model?
Exactly. So just before I say that, I should probably mention that with the SIR model and its extensions such as the SEIR with the exposed class and so on, you have these parameters that determine sort of how S goes to I, how I goes to I, and so on, like chemical reactions. And that's because you're looking almost at an individual, like molecular level. But when you want to make sort of population-wide forecasts and so on, it helps to instead think about how the epidemic is kind of behaving, sort of behaving on a sort of more macro scale. And the branching process model or renewal model is one fundamental way to do that as well. And it also has roots from far back because it's based on an equation from Lotka and Euler, who they were looking, well, independently at different times, but they were looking at reproduction in a population. And they had an equation for how that population would grow given some reproductive parameters. And it turns out you could think of an epidemic like that because when an infected person generates 2 infections, say, that's, if you drew that as sort of like a tree, that's like one node going to two leaves. It's kind of a reproductive or branching process. And so what the renewal process says, which it takes this Lotka-Euler sort of reproductive approach and sort of specializes it a bit for epidemics. And what it does is it says the reproduction or branching of the number of infected people in the epidemic. So we only focused on that because that's sort of the key one-dimensional time series we might want to predict or learn about. The number of infected people in that epidemic will change depending on two particular bits of information. One is this reproduction number, which I spoke of previously as being linked to herd immunity, for example. And the reproduction number says, so if the reproduction number is, say, 2, it means that on average, across a generation, and I'll get to what a generation is just now, across a generation, one infected person will lead to 2 infections. So in generation 1, we'd have 1 infection, generation 2 would have 2 infections.
And so to clarify, if the person remains infected, they are included in that number, right? So to produce 2 individuals, 2 infected individuals, you can either sort of infect 2 other people and yourself become cured, or you can remain sick and also infect another person.
Yeah, because if R was less than 1, you couldn't sustain the infection.
Right. So if R is less than 1, that means on average, like, people are getting healthier and infecting like fewer people than I guess they are getting better.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Or on average, that person has been sufficiently isolated that they're rarely, like, they're getting better, or most of their contacts, maybe the people they're in contact with have immunity or improved protection against that, and hence sometimes they might be infected, sometimes not.
But like, if no one is getting better, then R cannot be less than 1, right? It will be basically 1.
Well, it can be in the sort of morbid case where everyone's dying. Which what it means is that there's a depletion of people you could potentially infect, which is also how you do isolation. When you isolate someone, you're kind of doing, it's just saying you're just removing the people they could infect. So this R parameter is very important. It's actually even been talked about. There's this Hollywood movie from a while ago with Matt Damon called Contagion, and they based their whole story around an R parameter. So this R parameter is sort of like this reproduction number. But as I mentioned, there's this generation time thing. So I said that it gives you the average number of people someone will infect in the next generation. And the way we describe this generation is we sort of think about the time it takes on average as well for that infected person to transmit. And that's sort of, if you look at it as like a population where, I don't know, one infected individual randomly encountered people and someone got infected and then someone else got infected a bit late and so on, you'll get a distribution. And you could sort of say the average time to the next infection is what we define the generation as. But we generally use the entire distribution. So sort of like to roll it back a bit, what we're saying is that the way that the infection spreads across a population is we have to have an idea of how it's multiplying, hence the reproduction, and how long it's taking to multiply, hence the generation time.
So you could maybe say that the generation time is like, so you have the R number, which is the average people that's going to be infected by
Yep.
one person, right? And then these events of getting infected, they're sort of distributed over time, right? And this gives us the distribution of, so in total we have R, but this R is spread over the lifetime of the individual and how exactly that is spread out over that time interval.
Exactly, yes. And this the reason why that's important as well is that if it takes a long, if the mean time to spread is long, you actually find that public health officials and stuff will probably find it easier to control that epidemic because they have more time to act. And that's actually been demonstrated in if you compare some attempts to say SARS versus I think maybe one of the flus, or pandemic flu. One of them, I don't remember exactly which one, but one of them was easier to control because that mean generation time was longer.
Yeah, that makes sense. And also, if the mean generation time is longer, it means that the epidemic itself grows more slowly.
Yeah, more slowly,
right? Because
exactly.
Eventually you'll infect these are individuals, but if you infect them right away, they will immediately go on and infect others. Whereas if you'll infect them in 10 years, then during these 10 years, they won't be infecting others.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's sort of like the R is kind of determining like a y-axis, and this mean generation time is kind of determining like a time axis, and you're letting this sort of thing go through the population, and that's our description of the epidemic. And the key point, so normally you can try to estimate the generation time distribution. It's sort of fixed for specific epidemics or diseases. We will assume that we kind of know that from other data. And what we'll be interested in is saying, well, if I looked at the number of people hospitalized or known to tested to have an infection across time, can I figure out what's going on with R?
Right. So we introduced these two core concepts, the reproduction number R and the generation time distribution.
Yes.
And I guess the third core concept we need to introduce is the epidemic curve, right?
Exactly, yes. So the epidemic curve is quite a standard way of looking at how an epidemic is spreading and acting, and it's just simply a sort of time series or time log of registered infections. So someone might be the WHO might be collecting information from various hospitals and health centers, tallying it up every day, and actually that's what was done to kind of figure out what was going on in the Ebola epidemic of 2015, well, 2014 to 16. And that's what led to the sort of people extrapolated those curves, and it led to the crazy news articles about Ebola is going to kill us all. Which brings into another point. It's also important having some bit of data, how you then proceed to use the model to predict from that bit of data. But the epidemic curve is kind of like the core bit of data that we have.
So the renewal model describes how you derive the epidemic curve from knowing the reproduction number and the generation time distribution.
That's correct.
But in practice, we want to go in the opposite direction. We assume that we know the number of infected cases over time. That's the epidemic curve. And somehow we know about the specific disease. We know its generation time distribution.
Correct.
But what we really want to understand is the R number, right? We want to estimate it and to understand where this epidemic is going. So how hard is it to estimate R from the reproduction number from the epidemic curve and the generation time distribution?
I should probably, before answering that, just give some context why we've sort of touched on it, but to be explicitly why we're so obsessed with this R parameter. It's that if R is less than 1, when we said the epidemic would die out, public health agencies and so on sort of tracking the epidemic could then be reasonably confident that the control measures they've implemented up until that point are working. And it's important to get this kind of estimate almost in real time or in real time, because if they thought that R was less than 1 and then stopped, say, doing as much vaccination, or in the case of animals, stopped culling, and then in reality, that was old information and R had gone back above 1, that relaxation of control measures could lead to the epidemic, what they call flaring up again, which has happened and did actually happen with Ebola. We also want to know how big R is above 1, because that kind of describes, as we mentioned, like how quickly that epidemic curve is going to rise. And if we know that, we could start planning, for example, because we'll be using that to kind of figure out how many infected people we expect in the future. We could use that to plan how many hospital beds we might need or other resources. And that's super useful in eventually controlling that epidemic.
Yeah, that's a great point about what happens if they stop vaccination, because the core thing about the reproduction number is that it rests on this core assumption that everything remains as it is. It's sort
exactly
of not a real concept. So maybe we should compare it with this other quantity. I don't remember the exact term for it, sort of like a case reproduction number. It's like the number of people that a given person will infect over time.
Right.
Not like on average without any assumptions, but really how many people are you going to infect? And that sort of represents a specific physical quantity, whereas the
effective reproduction.
Yeah, the effective reproduction number is like a synthetic quantity that involves these assumptions.
Exactly. And as you brought that up, just to sort of to give you an idea of what, so as we were mentioning that this R is kind of telling you the average number of people someone will infect. If you start to think about the epidemic on finer sort of scales of, so we're heading back a little bit towards the individual level, which was described by the SIR models and so on. You could, as you were saying, you could track someone and see how many people they've infected, and then track the people they've infected and see. And you could find that you'll get numbers that vary very wildly. So for example, with SARS, there's a case where someone is believed to have been in an elevator and they sort of infected everyone in that elevator. And that was, they call those events super spreading events. And that is a separate issue that needs to be considered. But it's, as you said, we're using the effective reproduction number because we're believing that this average is telling us up-to-date information as long as we're calculating that average in real time. And I guess and going back to your previous question about what's the difficulty, well, the key difficulty is we want to keep this R term in real time, but we also understand that the epidemic doesn't well, there's two issues really. We want to keep this R term in real time, but we understand our ability to estimate R depends on how many time points we believe to, or how many time points of infected people, which portion of the epidemic curve, you could say, we believe informs us about R now.
Right, so why can't we just take the whole epidemic curve and make inferences based on that?
So if we take the whole epidemic curve and we say the entire curve describes a single R value, for example, we'll end up with a situation where we will estimate that R very well. It will have what you'd say a high precision, which means a low uncertainty around that estimate. But that estimate would not properly represent what's going on in the epidemic. It would be extremely biased. And the reason for that is the epidemic behavior changes across time. So for early on in an epidemic, there might be this growth of the epidemic, and the R parameter might be a large value, generally above 1. But later on, when the epidemic is dying, when control measures have kicked in, that R will be less than 1. If we used just the whole epidemic curve to infer single R, we'll get some average of those two things, which doesn't really tell us what's happening in each stage of the epidemic. Now, we could go the other route and say, well, every single new day for all the infected cases were generated by a different reproduction number. So we make R a time series itself. And now that allows us maximum flexibility to get trends, so variations in reproduction number across time. But now we're only using 1 day's worth of data to inform our parameter, and that will lead to very noisy estimates. So while we could track different trends, we now can't really be as confident in what's happening. And if we have a large confidence interval around our R value, say we estimated a mean value of 0.9, but the confidence is between 0.3 and 2, well, if it actually turns out to be closer to 2, that's a totally different epidemic we need to deal with than if it is closer to 0.9.
Right, so the buzzword we maybe should bring up is the bias variance trade-off.
Exactly, yeah. We have to find a way to trade off between what we believe to be the amount of data or the portion of the epidemic curve that's informing us about what's happening now. And the way we do that is we think about having a window back in time from, say, today, which tells us that everything, all the data in that window, we believe to have the same R value. And this is an assumption that's important, not just because of the bias variance trade-off in how we estimate R, but also because it's making an assumption about how quickly we think our epidemic is changing. And just to qualify that, a real epidemic is, of course, this time-varying stochastic structure. So at any point when we're sort of trying to narrow it down to a bunch of parameters, we're making assumptions about stationarity, is called, so how quickly parameters and variables of the epidemic are changing. So selecting this window length can have a big influence on what our estimates would be, and potentially then change how we act in terms of policies and so on based on this R. And I should point out that this type of model and this type of analysis has been used in forecasting. It has been used to try and understand what's been going on, even or has gone on retrospectively in epidemics. So it is tied to what public agencies are actually using. It's not all that they're actually using, because generally we have other types of data sources as well, but it is one of the important tools.
Cool. So it sounds like we want to know the reproduction number, and for that we need to choose the window size of how far back to look at the epidemic curve. And what options do we have to choose that window size?
So currently for the branching process model, because I suspect as it's a bit newer than the SIR type stuff, there's not that much theory surrounding what we should do. As a consequence, people generally who use it to analyze epidemics, and it has been used on, say, flu or SARS or measles and so on, they tend to use trial and error. They basically have some ad hoc means of picking window length, and generally they sort of do it. They sort of like test the sensitivity of that. So it'd be like, I'm going to use a window length of 10 days, see what my estimates look like, and then use one of 20 days. And if it doesn't look too different, then maybe 10 days is fine. That sort of kind of argument. No formal way yet exists for this problem.
Yeah, which is not great, right?
No, it's not great. I think what's happened is it's kind of it's very much a more methods problem that is important for epidemiology rather than an epidemiological problem. So I think it hasn't received as much attention, and people generally think or have some belief that smoother curves for R, smoother estimates of R across time are more believable.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and that definitely makes sense, but only to you need a way to actually be sure of that, especially if you want to make predictions from this stuff.
So what's the danger of over smoothing?
So the danger of over smoothing is if we go back to the first example where I said, imagine if we just took one single R value from the entire epidemic curve, right?
Mm-hmm.
That would look super, well, I mean, it'll look ridiculously smooth because it's like a line, but it'd be very smooth, and our confidence interval would be small because we've assumed that all this data is informing on this parameter. And that would be misleading because that number would not give us, well, it could tell us, for example, if that average across the whole epidemic turned out to be less than 1, for example, it might deceive us into thinking everything is fine when it's not, or it might, in terms of operationally, it's not giving us any details to really work with, across the. So the bias in choosing too long a window is that, there are two problems. One is that we might be misled, and secondly, and this is probably more useful for when you're responding to an epidemic in real time, it means that every new bit of data we have actually only changes our understanding of the epidemic in a very small way. And that makes it hard to really respond to real-time changes. So just to qualify that, if 100 days of an epidemic have been ongoing and we very quickly implemented some sort of control protocol, and we then check 5 days later to see if it's had any effect, we're not really going to be able to tell for some time because that long window is going to be using 100 days of data that are not actually relevant anymore to this bit of because we've changed R effectively.
Yeah. So like if I were approaching this just sort of brainstorming for a bit, maybe I would try to do some kind of exponential what's it called?
Smoothing.
Exponential smoothing, yeah, where the newer points count for more. I'm not sure how hard it is to incorporate into the estimator for R, but instead of making an abrupt cutoff at the window length, you would sort of smoothly incorporate all the points, but give more weight to the more recent points.
Yes, you could definitely do that. One thing that's implicitly in these models is you tend to, because all of this is Bayesian inference, you tend to put a prior on what you believe R might be. And that sort of, in itself, does some smoothing, because it throws out, say, some really extreme values, for example. But yes, there's different ways. There's sort of different, because this is a signal processing problem, really. So there's various smoothers, moving average windows, things like this that you could do to sort of try to work out where the stationary points are. They just haven't really been explored yet for this problem. And I should probably point out one of the things that makes this problem slightly more difficult is, so explicitly what we're saying is the infected number of people say today, depend on a previous reproduction number and on the generation time distribution. The generation time distribution itself is being used with all the past incidence variables. So there's actually also an extra inbuilt dependence on past incidence values as well. So there's a bit of correlation inside the model too.
Right, and I guess even if we apply these signal processing or time series analysis methods, there are still some parameters that we may need to adjust, right? Like the parameters of the exponential smoothing, for example.
Yeah, like the time constant, right? I think it's called. Yeah.
And you propose a systematic approach to decide what the optimal value of these parameters or hyperparameters is, right? So what's your core idea here?
Right. So I'll first off just explain more generally what the idea is before I get into how it's applied to the renewal or branching process model. But so my idea is you have to sort of think what a realistic model is, or sort of just philosophically even just go back to what that means. Now, in broader picture terms, across all models in epidemiology, whether it be the SIR types, the renewal types, or other types, there are other models that are sort of look a bit more like curve fitting, for example. There's been this issue that because there's all these things going on in an epidemic, and sometimes we want to put in all the biological details, or all the things that we think affects the physics of the epidemic. And by physics of the epidemic, I might just mean how it spreads. Because we want to do that, we could end up with quite complex models. I mean, the reason we're talking about the renewal model right now is just because when you want to look at the population scale, you don't need the complexity of individual level interactions that the SIR allows, for example. Now, it might be biologically true, for example, that we need to have all these different parameters in our model, and there might be very good reasons for that. But, and people might say, well, the more we have all this known physics in, the more realistic our model is, and that's kind of like the standard viewpoint. Now, what some guys in the information theory world, a bunch of researchers from since the 1960s, have been thinking about is they've been thinking about models in terms constrained by the data that we have. So a model with a bunch of parameters that we know maybe should be there biologically or physically, but we can't in any way constrain with the data, that's not useful. So they have this Occam's razor type approach where they said a realistic model is kind of the most complex model that the data allows, or it's a justified model in terms of confident fitting of parameters. And this is analogous to actually in information theory doing compression. And just conceptually just means that your model is a way of compressing data, and the best model is the one that does the best compression.
So maybe it's worth elaborating a bit. How exactly does a model compress the data?
So the idea is simply that if we have some bit of data and we want to communicate that to someone, we could do that in our model freeway, which we just tell them every single value or so on. Or we could have some parameters that sort of describe the underlying process and then describe the data in terms of those parameters, which is almost like doing the model fitting and so on and so forth. And the idea behind when you do something like that, you're pulling out sort of the main features of the data, you're putting them in your model, and that allows you to actually compress what you send across, because you send across the model and you send across whatever extra bits remain, like residuals, you could almost think of. Mm-hmm. And when some guys, particularly a guy called Jorma Rissanen, did this, he realized that if you looked at the model that led to the minimum description, so the minimum code length, you could say...
The minimum number of bits needed to transmit all the values.
Yeah, the minimum number of bits you need to transmit the values. He actually found that that was a consistent and sensible way to define what I've been calling a realistic model. And it also matched up with so probably I should mention that the very best in model selection out there right now is called Bayesian model selection. And it's generally quite computationally difficult, but it's seen as like the gold standard. And Rasanen found that his approach, which doesn't really even seem to be, it seems like completely different conceptually, actually converged to what that Bayesian model selection would give you. Now, to bring that all back to renewal models, I sort of take that philosophy of saying, well, in terms of the reproduction numbers and this window, I need to only select windows that are sensible with respect to, you could say, some sort of compression. But the way I do this compression idea is very implicit. And this is probably a bit of a leap, but what it says is if you do this, if you choose the model that compresses best, you also choose the model that predicts the next value best.
Right. So to put it into concrete terms, let's say you want to communicate to me the incidence curve, right?
Yeah.
The number of infected people, and one option is to transmit every single daily value.
Yeah.
Right. Or you could fit a curve using some reproduction numbers.
Yeah.
And then just transmit these reproduction numbers. And so in the limit, if you pick the window of size 1, you'll be transmitting as many reproduction numbers as there are days, as there are incidence values.
Yes.
And that's not very useful. You're not compressing much, right? So that sort of forces you to pick more frugal or less overfitting models.
Exactly. And the sort of, but the way that we actually do this practically is that we don't actually compute any code lengths or anything like that. It turns out we could use something called the accumulative predicted error, which is just a big way of saying what we do is we look at our epidemic curve and we pick a point, say time t. We use all the data for and we pick various windows. We use different windows back from t. We compute our estimates of r, and then we use those estimates to predict the number of infected we expect at time t plus 1. Now we do this across our total epidemic curve, so at every t, and we generate a score based on how well we've predicted every incident or infection data point. And then we do this for different window lengths, and whichever window length yields the lowest score, that's the one that's deemed to actually be compressing it best. And to probably also think about it in terms of more machine learning terms or more standard bioinformatics terms, you would say that that's also the model that would minimize generalization error. So if you got another data set from the same underlying process, it would be best able to describe that as well.
Right, and sort of the standard way to assess the generalization error is cross-validation, and you can look at this as like the analog of cross-validation for time series. So for time series, you cannot do like the naive cross-validation because you have to keep the ordering of time points, right?
Yeah.
But if you would imagine like a straightforward analog of cross-validation for time series, that is sort of like it, but you have an interesting twist where you don't simply infer a single value of R and use that to predict, right? But you sort of integrate over all the values of R. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So what's going on is that we have, at any point in time when we estimate an R from a window, we would have a distribution of possible, our estimate would have uncertainty around it, and that would be described by a distribution. Now we could predict values we could draw R's from that distribution and predict different incidence values for the next time point, which are counts of infections. So what that process, which you would do, say, computationally, you could also do mathematically, but just integrating across that entire distribution. And if you do that for the renewal model, because of how it's set up, you get a very nice expression based on the negative binomial distribution that describes the predictive, sort of like how likely we are to see 1, 2, 5, 10, whatever number of infected people at the next time point. And what we could do then is we then take the actual, because remember we're using data we already have, we've just been treating it step by step. So we take the actual data t+1 and we evaluate it, we find the probability corresponding to it from that distribution.
Right. So how likely we were to predict that?
Yeah, how
true
likely we were
value.
to predict it. Yeah. And then that produces, we take the log of that or negative of the log of that, and that produces the score for that data point.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of, you could think of it as being sort of like a log likelihood. At this point, what you want to do is you want to do this thing sequentially across all t values. What that helps with is, for example, if I used a very long time window and actually my epidemic was changing quite quickly, then my predictions are not going to be very good because they're almost going to be roughly similar because I've used this huge window, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to get a quite large score across the whole epidemic. If you used, of course, if the epidemic actually was changing very slowly, then our predictions would start to make sense and our score would decrease. And that's kind of the idea behind it. So what we're effectively doing is by predicting the next data point within our data set, we're sort of saying this is a way to characterize how quickly the epidemic statistics are changing.
And so to summarize, you sort of use this inspiration from information theory.
Yes.
To develop a relatively simple method, right, which does not attempt to like enumerate all possible encodings of the data, but it uses maybe some approximations to derive like a reasonable estimate for the model complexity, and then you sort of minimize the total description length, which involves, well, I guess your description length is just how many values you need to transmit.
Yeah.
Right. What is the penalty for having too few parameters to transmit? Right. So you pay only a few bits of information to transmit very few parameters. Right, but then
because you don't describe the actual curve well, you don't fit it very well. You have to pay a lot for that excess, for those errors, you could say.
So you somehow need to convert those errors into bits as well. So you imagine like encoding the errors themselves, right?
Yeah.
And like the larger, you assume that the larger the errors, the more bits.
Yeah.
You have to.
Or perhaps to like take it to the next extreme, it's if you used one parameter per data point, then you don't have any errors to transmit, but you have this really complicated model to put forth. But to just kind of, for conceptual intuition of why this accumulative predictive error is the right thing to do versus, say, taking a squared error or doing anything else really, it's probably 3 points that are worth mentioning. One is that, as you said with the cross-validation, if you actually did cross-validation or cross-validation based methods, they assume that you could permute your data, and we can't do that here because things depend on each other causally. It's like incidence values in the past contribute to the incidence in the future via the generation time distribution. So we really need that causality in there. Secondly is that this method doesn't make any assumptions about the model that it's being used. So you could actually take the same method, you'd have to derive a different predictive distribution, but you can take the same method and go and try and predict stuff with SIR type models, and maybe you want to characterize how many compartments. So you might say I have a SIR and I have a SEIR, and I'm still trying to predict infected people. Which one makes more sense? And you could still use this broadly, this method. The other thing worth mentioning, it's a bit more of theoretical interest, is the reason that this sort of sequential causal thing works is that you could take a joint distribution and you could always factor it as, so you could take probability x1, x2, x3, and you could always factor it as a probability of x3 given x2 multiplied by a probability of x2 given x1 multiplied by probability of x1. And those factorizations are actually those predictive distributions that I've been talking about. So this accumulative prediction error is trying to actually get you the best joint distribution, or you could say the log of that joint distribution, and that becomes the score. Now, that score, this log of your joint distribution, is actually maps directly to a code length in some way. So that's just the conceptual link there. So that's why doing this ape thing, accumulative prediction error, actually leads you to doing the compression. But so that's useful. And then probably the most important bit practically for why this could be good for these models is, as I mentioned, renewal models, because they are looking at this sort of population-wide macro detail, and we're really interested in sort of macro behaviors. Is the epidemic over? Is it going to increase? Is it falling? Is control working? So on. We want to get that information quickly, and this sort of model selection or window selection is good because you could compute it quite easily. So you don't need to go to Bayesian model selection, which would be the gold standard, which would require lots of integrations and maybe Markov chain Monte Carlo procedures. Yeah, so there's methods. You just draw numbers out of your draw probabilities from your negative binomial distribution. So it's exact, effectively.
And on the subject of applying the same method to different models, you actually did something pretty incredible and applied the same method to like a completely different domain, not just a different epidemic type, right? But you applied it to the coalescent model.
Yes.
So how did that happen?
Right. So the coalescent process, I won't go too much into it, but it does have links to epidemiology, but it's used in almost a different field completely, which is phylogenetics. And what it describes is a tree where you could think of the tips of that tree as being samples of infected people, and you kind of want to work out their ancestry.
So is the idea here, so what do you apply the phylogeny to? Do you apply it not to the people, right, but maybe to the viruses or bacteria that you extract?
Yeah, yes, correct. You could get samples of the virus from different people, and then you could construct this tree based on genetic mutations and so on. The reason for using this tree is that you try to work out what they call the effective population size, which in the case of an epidemic is kind of like our eyes, but not quite exactly. But so they're trying to infer that. So they're saying we don't know that. What we have is a sample from the population of the virus, and we have a tree that describes something. So it's related, but it's a very, very different model in terms of what it's trying to do. But interestingly, if you look at the maths behind it, so I didn't mention this, but in the renewal model, sort of the statistics being used were Poisson statistics. So it just meant that the number of infected people at time t, it, followed a Poisson distribution that depended on the reproduction number at that time and sort of like the generation time multiplied by past infected people, like in a sensible way. Now, the coalescent process, the branching points of its tree also have a Poisson distribution, but there you actually have the individual events. So what happened in the renewal model is when we say we saw 5 infected today, that's kind of like 5 events happened. We don't know when in the day it happened, so we've aggregated it across the day. In the coalescent process, you have the actual event times. But what you could do is you could group those times and treat it like the way that we did our epidemic curve. And then you'll find that the statistics of these models are quite, they all involve types of windows and types of Poisson distributions. And then therefore you could use, therefore you could use, again, similar methods related to these minimum description lengths and so on, and they're actually computable for these types of models.
How do these sort of windows or this model complexity, how does it arise in the coalescent model?
So the coalescent model says, so in the same way that we don't really know what the true time-varying function describing R is, it could be very complex, and we approximate it with constants that change across time. You could say piecewise constant functions. They also use piecewise constant functions to describe this effective population size, which could be doing all sorts of things as well. And the model that does that is quite a popular model called the skyline model. It was called skyline model because the estimate you would get would be this piecewise thing that they thought looked like the skyline of a city, for example. So that's where you could say the window size comes in. In that world, they've done a bit more work on that though, but the solutions that currently exist for choosing window size, and again, window size has the same bias variance ideas for this process. The methods that they've used have often been quite computationally complex, including the Bayesian model selection stuff. So they do have solutions, it's just that they take a fair bit of time to run, and they're often doing some extra things in the background because the model sort of fits in with a couple others. But you could, if you wanted a quick idea of what would be a sensible way to choose your window sizes for population size, you could use the same method. You'd get a different distribution.
Mm-hmm.
And I should probably say on a side note that for those of you who are into statistical models, if you choose your window size to be such that every event or every data point matches a parameter, so we have a one-to-one correspondence, so like a definite overfitting model, right? Mm-hmm. You could very much suffer issues with statistical identifiability because, for example, if we go back to the epidemic curve idea, if one day we didn't see any infected people, we wouldn't be able to estimate any R there, really. So that would be unidentifiable. The strange thing in the coalescent world is that that's exactly the model that they use, but they then assume some autocorrelations to kind of create the window. So it's a little bit implicit, but effectively what we're saying is that these information theoretic methods, which might seem very abstract, they seem to come out of a completely different realm with all these code lengths and stuff. They can be practically applied to models that are popular in biology, in these cases, phylogenetics and epidemiology.
Cool, very cool. So anything else you want to bring up before we wrap this up?
No, I think it's probably just worth emphasizing the point about the need for formal ways of doing things like window size selection and so on, because many may see that sort of like when you're doing your whole big analysis, that might just be seen as like just another little detail. But things like these can have wide-ranging effects. It's kind of similar to the idea of how you set priors, for example. People may often set priors and say, well, we just set something to make things computable, and they may not go and then interrogate the reliability of that. So to see, for example, in the case of priors specifically, they might not check, those being recommended more and more, how much their posteriors differ from their priors, for example.
Right, so like the sensitivity analysis.
Sensitivity analysis, exactly.
Right, but that's exactly what you criticized at the beginning of this podcast, right? You said they look, if different window sizes give the same estimate, that's good enough.
Exactly. And so little things like paying attention to something like window length, which for most people using models like these, that would not be their main concern. Their main concern is just the estimate of R. But paying attention to things like window length, they do have like downstream effects, especially if, as I said before, using the minimum description length model is actually best for prediction, and prediction is sort of currently the most important thing in epidemiology, or one of the most important things in epidemiology, because right now with things like Ebola and so on, you find that you get epidemics happening and no one sort of expects it, and they scramble and they try to act upon it, and you want to act upon it quickly, and you need reliable predictions more than necessarily anything else. So it's just important to, so this window length stuff is one little piece of that puzzle, but I think it's worth, when everyone's doing their analyses, to think about all these steps, because they can sort of confound things later on.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think about the idea of maybe without going into Bayesian model comparison, but doing more Bayesian style of analysis where you sort of consider maybe a distribution over window sizes or something, right? And sort of averaging across them, giving them different weights based on how well they can predict the data?
So actually, I think that's, if you don't, so for the case with the renewal model and the coalescent process, it was possible to derive like explicit theory, right? So explicit distributions and so on. But generally, doing things like model averaging, where you might say, I might take a group of possible windows and then look at each of their predictions and then take sort of a statistic of that, like the mean or so on. That's generally shown to be a good thing, and definitely better than depending on a single window. So in the case of when you don't have any explicit theory to go on and so on, I think that's actually a recommended move, to be honest, because it has been shown to be within a certain, I can't remember exactly what, and I guess there are various problems, but they are known to be within a certain order of error from whatever would be the optimal model.
Mm-hmm.
So you do pretty good just by doing things like that. And Bayesian analysis in general is perhaps, which is where also this stuff fits in, is perhaps worth mentioning that when you'd add priors to various parameters, and then you'd run things, and then you might find all sorts of assumptions seeping in, and having these ways like posterior predictive checks and so on are super useful to preventing what is like the most known problems, but still rampant overfitting and underfitting effectively.
Cool. All right, Kris, thanks for teaching us about epidemics modeling. Cool stuff, and thanks for doing the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me and giving me a chance to talk about this stuff.